Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Say like what? Sorry, I didn't get. Yeah.
Like instead of words like
yeah. Yeah.
What if you just like say it in your head?
Doesn't work. It's kind of like I hear it in my. I say it in my head and then it comes out, so I know what I'm gonna say, but then. I can't because the forces. I have to like. It's this. It's like an. I don't know how to explain it. I wish. You know how like if you need to cough, you can't always cough quietly. Sometimes you really have to have a really big cough. Like if you just because otherwise it doesn't get that feelings go away or something. Like yeah. You get it? Yeah.
You can write a song.
About what? Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson. Oh. Fucking hell. Ha ha.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining me today as we talk about Tourette syndrome and discuss some of the things that will be relevant for you in the classroom and at home and in the playground. So I thought we'd start with a little bit of a background on Tourette syndrome, just so that we're all on the same page, so to speak. So, if you didn't already know, it's a hereditary neurodevelopment disorder in the tic order, the tic disorder category. Tics are sudden, unpredictable, repetitive body actions, such as vocalizations and movements. The tics can either be vocal, motor, that is physical, or both. And usually manifests in early childhood. Could be as early as 2, but typically between the ages of 4 and 18, you'll see the onset. A Tourette's diagnosis is characterized by unintentional movements or sound called tics. So, how does this fit into a school setting? Well, having this condition is difficult for everybody. The effect cannot be underestimated. As parents with children suffering from this disorder, you would appreciate that there is concern, both emotionally, psychologically, that would come when you have a child with Tourette syndrome. And for the child itself, life is challenging, and it can be especially challenging for children in the school environment. So who was Tourette? Who was Georges Gilles de la Tourette? He was a French doctor who first described the condition in the 1880s. He's been credited with attributing it to a French noblewoman, and the diagnosis was based on the involuntary motor tics and verbal tics. What causes Tourette's? The causes, unfortunately, have not been identified, but some of the brain function has, and the research has linked Tourette syndrome to affected nerve cells in the basal ganglia. It disrupts the messages between different parts of the brain and affects the chemical composition in the brain, and that goes some way to describing the process researchers said that the causes are yet unknown. To add frustration to a already complex problem. So the treatment, given that the cause is unknown, we can only treat the symptoms to a certain extent, and there's a multimodal approach to doing that. There's behaviour treatment, which is, as the name suggests, trying to modify and deal with the symptoms as the physical and observable symptoms as they arise. So some behaviour strategies could include awareness of the individual on when and where and how these tics will manifest, and taking some preemptive response or reacting in a real time with a real-time countermeasure. There's also medications which have varied degree of effectiveness, and some examples of electro-brain stimulation. It's interesting to note that Tourette's is not a degenerative condition. As such, it does not get worse with age, and suffering or being diagnosed with Tourette's should not and does not affect life expectancy. So it is possible for a Tourette diagnosis to continue to lead a normal, healthy and productive life, and that's interesting to note. In schools, so this is really what we're here to talk about, and there's a lot of good research coming out of the school system with regard to learning support and Tourette's, it's also particularly relevant in Tourette's, as we discussed earlier. The symptoms sort of manifest in early childhood from ages 2 to 4, so it's right in that school age zone, and by the time the condition sufferers reach adulthood, they may have developed and learned to control it to some extent. So those formative years are compounded, even further by the involuntary tics, the motor tics and the verbal and the vocalizations. Also interesting to note that it is estimated that as many as 1% of school-age children exhibit the symptoms of Tourette syndrome, and this may or may not surprise you, but given that with good management strategies and the natural aging process, the symptoms become less severe in the older the child gets. Given the high prevalence, the best advice is that the schools and education providers, as well as families and other service providers in that sector, provide a supportive environment and have the best resources and knowledges available to them at the time. So following into the school and support systems for students, we implement the individual education plans, or we can do if it's necessary. And these are specific tailored education plans that are customised to support individual student needs. Modifications or systems and practices include you know, coming up with sensible learning objectives, discussing the systemic support that will be available, assessing and evaluating how systems are implemented and what best practices are, and constantly reevaluating and assessing. It may include having a learning support teacher in the classroom. It may include optimized test conditions with you know, writing assistance or reading assistance or verbal assistance, and this is necessary as to provide the best support for each and every student in our school system. Social interaction. If I haven't already mentioned it, at this point it's probably a good time to consider that Tourette's has a very high prevalence of comorbid conditions. That is, it's very rare to be diagnosed with Tourette syndrome alone. And some of the more common comorbid conditions include ADHD or anxiety, and these trifecta, if you like, of conditions can actually go down the path towards a self-perpetuating problem, if you like, in that the Tourette's leads to anxiety, you know, the ADHD contributes to you know, social isolation, which leads to greater anxiety. The anxiety brings on the effect of the tic, and they become more uncontrollable and more prevalent, and so, you know, it feeds on itself, and it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. In a research report by Epen, Kavana and Robertson, 2016, on the quality of life in Tourette syndrome, they suggest that students with Tourette's are ashamed of themselves and feel embarrassed because of their tics. You know, they're fully aware that they're drawing attention to themselves, and in some ways they feel different to other students. The good news is that strong pro-social intervention can have a direct and positive impact on the lives of Tourette students, and this is simply an inverse relationship to the you know, the feeling of self-esteem and self-determination, and the positive social interaction empowers everybody, but in the case of somebody with Tourette, it empowers them to take greater control of their lives, and that's a great thing too. Emotional needs. The emotional needs of a Tourette student. Given their trouble with their social interaction, it's a logical sequence to recognise that they may have issues with their emotional needs, and you know, this stems from their insecure peer attachment, you know, which can lead to depression, low self-esteem. You know, they find it difficult to fit in. They have issues interacting with their peers. You know, school-age children are perhaps not the most sensitive, and you know, they're quite reactive. They're still to some degree in a state of nature, and you know, they may make fun of or ridicule somebody that's different or with uncontrollable tics, and it's important to think about strategies to manage the socio-emotional needs of a Tourette student. And current thinking is that a multimodal approach, which includes the behaviour therapy, parental guidance, educational consultation, and if the need arises, medication and psychotherapy. At home, Tourette syndrome at home. So the parents, you guys are going to be, at the coalface 24/7. The kids are going to go home from school, and they're probably, if they've had a difficult day, they're probably looking forward to going home and finding some comfort there. And I'm sure it's a challenge for the families and the parents. I'll just throw another statistic at you. In the Wadman, Glazebrook, Parks and Jackson paper 2016, they recorded that 25% of students with Tourette's reported cases of peer rejection and peer victimization. So, these kids are going to be taking these problems home with them. And the best strategy for the parents is as much education and knowledge around the issues that they can, and they will be required to wear many hats. They'll have to step in as a teacher, a carer, a friend, and an advocate, just to name a few. So we're looking at a multidisciplinary approach and a multimodal approach. This is, evolved over time, that we communicate better with all the relevant stakeholders. The medical professionals, the parents, the teachers, the students' peers. So educating the other students in the classroom and the playground, and working together, we can provide the most appropriate diagnosis, intervention, counselling and support, and medical attention for the Tourette student. And lastly, I'd just like to briefly discuss some of the assistive technologies, and this is an area that I'm really excited about, and it's fantastic. The progress that is being made. We all love our smartphones, and the power of applications, mobile applications these days is amazing. And there's some great assistive technologies that are applicable for a Tourette student, including using the phone to record your lesson, both in audio and video, and then that student, if they're struggling to keep up in class, can watch the video at home as many times as they need to, and that's a great way for them to catch up and to keep up with the learning process. There's great advances in word processors, and speech-to-text devices. So depending on the context, with Tourette's being a two-pronged sort of condition that is both physical and verbal or vocal, some Tourette's students will have difficulty speaking because their tics will impede their ability to communicate effectively. And what a great thing that we have word processors that can do speech to text. So, and or text to speech. So, if they're speech impediment is more profound than their physical impediment, and they have the capacity to type. You know, they've got an opportunity to communicate with a text-to-speech application. They can simply write down what they want to say and press play, and an electronic voice will read it out. Interestingly, this works both ways. If they're listening to some audio, or if they're a great speaker, but they have difficulty controlling their hands, they can speak into a recording device and get that converted into text. This helps profoundly and is fantastic. So just to recap, we discussed about Tourette's, and we watched the short video as an introduction, and we can see and appreciate and understand the various levels of Tourette's, both physical and vocal. It operates on a degree of severity. We briefly met the man who named the condition in the 1880s. We were made aware that the cause is unknown, but they are identifying the areas of the brain where the condition manifests, and how that affects the motor skills and the vocal skills. We talked about the treatment, behavioural treatments, psychotherapy, medication. We talked about the context in school, what effect that has on the student, their emotional state, their ability to study, whether or not they have the capacity to take notes in class, whether or not they have the ability to communicate to their students or their teachers. We talked about what the schools are doing to help, the individual education plans, the support systems, the review processes. We talked about the importance of social interaction and having strong pro-social interactions. We talked about the emotional needs, and we brought attention to the awareness of the emotional needs. We acknowledged that Tourette syndrome is not just at school. It's 24/7. It's at home. It's at work if you're of working age, and it's at school. We talked about the multidisciplinary approach. And lastly, we talked about the assistive technologies. So thank you very much for paying attention, and I look forward to catching up to you in the next video. Take care.